Belfast, after 12 years of what the Irish call the Troubles. In Northern Ireland, there are two communities with different loyalties. Protestants largely give their allegiance to the United Kingdom. Most Catholics feel that Northern Ireland should be part of a united Ireland. Today, the British Army patrols the province to hold apart the warring extremists of both communities, the result of a long history of conflict and political failure. "15 years ago, scenes like these were unimaginable. At that time, the Protestant Unionist Party had been in power for 40 years. The Protestant ascendancy seemed assured. The state appeared secure. But the events that would bring British troops back to Ireland again were imminent. The current phase of the Troubles was about to begin. It would take the form of a Catholic rebellion. July 1966. Queen Elizabeth II visits Northern Ireland. The Protestant majority greet their British monarch. Their loyalty expresses not only a desire to be British, but also a fear that they might be forced to be part of a united Catholic Ireland, which would threaten their Protestant way of life. So the Queen's visit was important and reassuring. Speaking to fellow Orangemen, Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, Captain Terence O'Neill, voiced loyalist feelings.
Alone, we would be a small, insignificant body of people lost in the Atlantic and surrounded by enemies. Many Ulstermen have fought in 2 wars to keep the flag of freedom flying around the world. Here in Ulster, the Union Jack is the flag of freedom. My task, my duty, and my resolve are to keep it hoisted at the top of the mast here in our beloved Ulster.
But Northern Ireland was a Protestant state for a Protestant people. As Catholics watched the Protestant Orange marches, they were reminded of their place in society. For 40 years, no Catholic had held important political office in Northern Ireland. Few Catholics had positions of any power within the apparatus of the state. The armed police of the province, for example, was almost entirely Protestant. The police reservists, B Specials, a backup force who kept their weapons at home, were all Protestants. The government was enabled under the Special Powers Act to suspend at the stroke of a pen all normal civil liberties, powers that had been regularly used against the Catholic minority. Many Catholics had opposed the state from its inception, some Republicans with violence. So, it was argued, such powers were needed to meet this threat. But by the mid-60s, republicanism was no longer a physical threat. The IRA had abandoned violence as a tactic. But Catholics were still disadvantaged. They were more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be in menial jobs, more likely to be badly housed, and less likely to be rehoused. There were, as it has been put, indignities available to Catholics that were not available to Protestants. Not everybody in Northern Ireland had the vote in local elections, and the local government electoral system had been manipulated in such a way as to keep Catholics out of power. In Londonderry, only one example, 2/3 of the population were Catholic, yet there was a Protestant Unionist council. All this discrimination was to be revealed later by the Cameron Report, but in the mid-60s, very few people in Britain were aware of these problems. The press and TV seldom reported from Northern Ireland, and rarely critically. Broadcasters were encouraged to leave reporting to the locals, who, it was said, best understood the region and its particular difficulties. There was an emphasis on the common ground between the two communities, rather than the differences. But in 1959, Alan Wicker reported for the BBC programme Tonight about Northern Ireland. Only the first report, on betting shops, was broadcast.
But sufficient was the degree of pressure exercised by the Stormont regime and by public opinion that the rest of the series was banned. And that was in 59, and for many years afterwards, something like 6 or 7, there were no investigative reports made of what was going on in Northern Ireland at all.
This week, 7th of July, 1966. As far as can be established, this week was the only national current affairs programme that reported on political affairs in Northern Ireland before 1968.
I know the word of God has many enemies. Church of Rome has burned it and banned it. The modernists have pen-knifed it. But praise God, the old book still stands, and it'll stand forevermore. So let's hear
the voice of the Reverend Ian Paisley rings out in Ulster, and many listen. To his audiences, he is Martin Luther come again, the true defender of the true Protestant faith. To opponents, he is a strutting turkey cock in the animal farm of Irish politics.
This report on Ian Paisley emphasised his religious rather than political appeal. It contained extracts from Paisley's speeches, who at that time was regarded as an inflammatory orator. As a result, this film was thought to be too provocative to be shown in Northern Ireland.
I can only, in my own tracing of the records, discover that on 1 or 2 occasions was it ever suggested that the minority population suffered discrimination. In fact, I would say that the account given of Northern Ireland society in the Cameron Report, which followed the immediate outbreak of the Troubles, was such that as to reveal to the total population elements of a situation which was unknown to many of them.
The media was not alone. By the convention of some 40 years, Westminster rarely discussed the province's internal affairs, yet Parliament had the final authority and responsibility for Northern Ireland.
Well, it was virtually impossible to raise about 9/10 of the issues. Anything that had been devolved upon the Government of Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act could not be raised on the floor of the House of Commons. And all the things that we really wanted to raise, all the grievances, just could not be raised. The Speaker would immediately rule you out of order. And the only thing I remember very clearly was Hugh de Largy, who was one of the few MPs interested in Northern Ireland, standing up and saying, "Mr. Speaker, what else can we raise except for the question of Harland and Wolff?"
The province had serious economic problems. Its main industries, shipbuilding and textiles, were depressed. Unemployment was high. With the economy needing reshaping, it made sense to cooperate with the Dublin government. But Protestants were alarmed when O'Neill invited Sean Lemass, the Irish Prime Minister, to Belfast in 1965. For over 40 years, the South, devoutly Catholic, had been hostile to the North. Its constitution not only laid claim to sovereignty over the North, but also enshrined Catholic theology. Protestant apprehensions increased when the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church met in Belfast in June 1966 to discuss closer ties with other churches. Some Ulster Protestants, particularly the fundamentalist Free Presbyterian Church, saw in these talks the danger of a Romeward trend and the erosion of Protestant values. Their leader was Ian Paisley. When this Protestant demonstration passed through a Roman Catholic district, Cromac Square, sectarian fighting broke out. Paisley was later charged with illegal assembly. But 1966 was also a year of anniversaries. 50 years before, thousands of Ulster men had been slaughtered at the Battle of the Somme. Protestants remember that sacrifice for Britain. But 1916 had seen another great event in Irish history remembered by Catholics. The Easter Rising in Dublin, which had set the South on the road to independence. Sectarian tension mounted when Protestant paramilitaries killed 2 Catholics. O'Neill voiced his fears.
In my opinion, brethren, the one way to endanger our Constitution is by violence, and by abuse, and by the gun. We live, ladies and gentlemen, in a changing world, and we must defend our Constitution and our Ulster heritage in a modern way. Nor is it necessary to do this kind of thing in order to be a true loyalist.
The Paisleyite opposed O'Neill's reforms simply because of the fact that they felt that he had not only compromised, but he had sold out on the constitutional position. Particularly in the middle 60s, when he went down south to meet with the Prime Minister of Dublin, and then he had the Prime Minister of Eire on an official visit to Belfast, to Stormont. And this they saw as a threat to the constitutional position, that some deal was going to be made with Dublin, and that Northern Ireland was going to be annexed into some arrangement with Dublin. And Paisley and the Paisleyites at that time felt that the best way to protect themselves was to attack the man who was making these reforms.
We want to show that this country is not a democratic country, but this country has been run by a group of dictators from Glengall Street.
Glengall Street housed the headquarters of O'Neill's Unionist Party.
And for years these men have tried to tell the Protestants of Ulster that they're loyal and they're true blues, but we have found them out now. They have been found out. The hidden things of darkness are being exposed in the light and in the focus of truth. God be with you till we meet.
Paisley was about to go to jail, having refused to be bound over for his part in the Cromac Square riot. But there was also disquiet about O'Neill in the inner councils of the Unionist Party.
Prime Minister, would you care to comment on the meeting, sir?
No, very, very happy meeting, very successful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Any criticism at all, Prime Minister?
No, very happy.
O'Neill was finding Northern Ireland unreceptive to economic and social reform. The Unionist chief whip was James Chichester Clark.
And I think there's a certain feeling that perhaps some the Unionist Party have gone soft on firm Unionist principles. Nothing could be further from the truth, but these are based on a good many misconceptions that are being spread. They're based on things like the Easter Rising or the Mass meeting, perhaps the ecumenical movement, all of which, although not directly, or many of which not directly affecting the government, are sometimes tied around the government's neck.
Now, when Protestants marched, they were worried by what O'Neill's liberal attitudes might unleash. Ian Paisley articulated their fears.
I'm a free-born Protestant, and all the intimidation, and all the slander, and all the lying about me will not stop me in my campaign in Ulster to keep Ulster out of the south of Ireland.
O'Neill's attempt to modernise Northern Ireland society was unleashing raw forces on his political right, but from the left he faced a demand for civil rights. During the 60s, there was an increasing number of radical groups of mostly, but not entirely, Catholics campaigning for social justice in the North. By 1968, they'd begun to consider direct action of a kind that was fashionable at the time. In Caledon, County Tyrone, a badly housed Catholic family was squatted here and evicted in front of television cameras. The house had been allocated by the Unionist Council to a young, single Protestant woman. A Catholic nationalist MP who had organised the squat spoke to Ulster Television.
Well, I've drawn attention, I might say, highlighted the situation. It's a form of non-violent protest, which I felt was necessary, considering that I'd used every parliamentary strategy possible to remedy this injustice, and I give no assurance that in the future that I will not resort to similar activities in order to highlight the position.
Social forces long at work in the Catholic community were about to erupt.
The generation of the early 60s was one which had not participated to the same extent in the defeats of previous periods and which had grown up completely within the state. So they weren't as demoralized or defeatist as their parents were. Another factor was the increasing availability of education as a result of the post-war Education Acts and so on, which brought a lot of the Catholic population into secondary education and third-level education for the first time, because previously these had been the prerogative of the rich. A third factor was the rising expectations as a result of the ending of the isolation of Northern Ireland society, with television in particular, opening perspectives of people to other societies. They were no longer living in closed society. They could see that other people in other areas didn't have to put up with what they put up with.
The civil rights marches which followed took their inspiration from the black civil rights movement in America. It was a radical time, the year of the student rising in France and worldwide opposition to the Vietnam War. But their demands were specific and simple: electoral reform, an end to discrimination in jobs and housing, the abolition of the Special Powers Act, and the B Specials, whom Catholics knew to be sectarian and partisan.
There was a united force of the people marching together in opposition to the lack of democratic rights in Northern Ireland.
The government had got away for 50 years just blatantly operating the policy of gerrymandering, which was particularly obvious in somewhere like Derry, and they didn't even bother to go to the trouble to hide it. It was quite blatant, and suddenly people said, we've had enough, we're going to protest.
These people had tried all the democratic channels, the lobbying of MPs, and had got nowhere. And therefore, as a last resort, they had opted for public demonstrations.
I wanted to march and protest. I wanted to sit down in the street. I wanted to tell as many people as I could.
But the biggest impetus certainly came from the Black Civil Rights Movement and a feeling among Catholics that if the blacks of America could take on that mighty nation, we could take on a tuppence halfpenny state.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would certainly hope that in conducting this march in our city, that we will act in a responsible manner, demonstrating to the authorities that our intentions are to secure civil rights for the people of our cities and not to cause strife or bloodshed in our city. We are demanding homes, employment, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We do not wish bloodshed or violence.
The march through the predominantly Catholic city of Derry was not to be allowed through its Protestant centre. The march was poorly marshalled. There was confusion, and the police battened the crowd. This film, transmitted around the world, brought the Northern Ireland question back into the headlines. The civil rights movement had shown that something was sorely wrong in the province.
They made the judgment that there was no possibility of reform through the Northern Ireland system, and that therefore they should go to Westminster, which had overall authority and which, with the Labour government, seemed more open to persuasion. And also that they should try to secure publicity for their aims on the new media which were available, like television, and publicity not just in Northern Ireland or just in the rest of Ireland or Britain, but also internationally to put pressure from outside upon the British.
I think that it would be fair to say that many Protestants in those days supported the call of the cry of the civil rights. But what happened was the civil rights movement was taken over by the Republican element, and then in particular by the IRA, which later became the Provisional IRA. And I think that once the Protestants saw the civil rights being taken over by the Republican element, that any sympathy they may have had for the civil rights was quickly eroded.
Among other demonstrations organised in response to events in Derry, Belfast students, mostly Catholic, were marching from Queen's University to City Hall. Strategically placed along their route was a loyalist counter-demonstration organised by Paisley. The police halted the civil rights march. Paisley's demonstration continued.
We will not have this part of the city desecrated by Republicans. Those that have cursed our flag have cursed our Queen and our art to destroy our country. And I want to say that we are determined as ever to resist the Republicans from Queen's University.
Effectively blocked by the police and Paisley, the students sat down. Disorder like this was becoming a feature of the province's life.
The law in Northern Ireland will be maintained in the interests of all. We cannot and will not allow it to be flouted, nor will we permit others to take it into their own hands. It must now be evident that in the present atmosphere, further civil disorder carries the gravest risks, not for any one section of our population, but for all. No cause other than the cause of anarchy will be served by further riot and commotion in our streets.
O'Neill later made concessions to the civil rights movement. This further disturbed Protestants. O'Neill was becoming isolated. But for Catholics, it was too little, too late.
I want to tell the Ulster Cabinet that this great civil rights cause, which has grown in our country, is going to continue until such times as every town, every village has fundamental civil rights, until houses are allocated on the basis of merit and not on the basis of favour, until such times as every man, irrespective of his creed or his class, will be granted a job, until such time as all the people over the age of 21 will be entitled to vote in every election in our country in a democratic country.
I felt it was just one of these periodical upsurges. It definitely was anti-government. It definitely was anti-British.
They were shouting about the inhumanities that were being done to the Catholics, and something this was happening to Catholics. Catholics couldn't get jobs, the Catholics couldn't get houses. But in the same token, I was a Protestant, and I couldn't get these things.
The whole community was reacting, almost as one person, to what we regarded as a very, very serious threat towards our way of life.
They just emphasised Catholic everything. I think that's what happened mainly to the Protestants as well when they saw this, most of the Protestants, that it was not a movement for civil rights, it was a movement for civil rights for Catholics and nobody else.
Mr. Prime Minister, what was the biggest achievement of tonight's meeting?
No comment.
O'Neill survived another vote of no confidence. It was proving difficult to hold a moderate middle ground. The marchers intended to go through Protestant areas. In a country where both Protestant and Catholic are acutely aware of their territory, this was a defiant act. We shall not. The march was blocked by Paisleyite demonstrators, harassed by Protestant vigilantes, and continually rerouted by the police.
We've had some difficulties along the route, and there are certain towns we've been prevented from going through. We don't like that, but we feel that that demonstrates the fact that in Northern Ireland we have a situation like the southern states of America, where you do not have the basic democratic liberty of free procession.
We are not afraid. We are not afraid.
On the fourth day, the march was stopped near Derry. The marchers were told that there were Protestants armed with homemade weapons ahead. District Inspector Hood warned them that they might be stoned, but did not suggest that the march should be rerouted. After some discussion, it was agreed that the police would escort the marchers over Burntollet Bridge.
Police have said they are quite prepared to get us through this obstacle. And if we all keep in very close formation on the right-hand side of the road, the people throwing the stones will be on high ground on the right-hand side. If we keep in close formation on the right-hand side under the hedge, keeping well into the right-hand half of the road, then we should be okay.
The marchers walked into a carefully prepared trap. Loyalists were waiting on the hillside above the road. Many of the attackers were off-duty B specials. the reserve police force. Police protection had been inadequate.
By the mere fact that they were going marching through loyalist areas, this in itself was provocation, as far as many Protestants saw it. And they reacted. Well, you had your Burntollet and the Waterside fracas and this type of thing. And basically it was because of the fact that the Protestant population feared this Republican threat and feared this Marxist threat. And this is the only way in which they could react against it.
The state was utterly sectarian, and that it was important to demonstrate the depth of the sectarian reality of the state to outside opinion. And that, I think, was the basic strategy behind the Burntollet March, where it was known that the march would meet resistance. But the point was to demonstrate that it was not possible to march from between the two major cities of Northern Ireland without being attacked by loyalist thugs, and to put to the test the state, to put to the test the state's forces.
The march had made its point. Its rapturous welcome by Derry Catholics illustrated how it had further polarised the two communities. The authority of moderates in Northern Ireland was further undermined. That night, the police went into the Bogside, the Catholic district of Derry, and, to quote a government report, were guilty of assault and battery, malicious damage, and the use of provocative sectarian and political slogans. Northern Ireland was at the point of no return. The 11th of January 1969. This civil rights march was scheduled to pass through the centre of Newry.
Last night, the local committee, on your behalf, made a decision. That decision was that they would not accept any reroute on this march. They would not accept this unjust and tyrannical ban imposed by the discredited Unionist government. It is our view that we cannot go forward and accept any reroutes.
The parade will not be permitted to turn left at this point.
Order!
Order! I would now appeal to you all to be sensible in this matter and to continue a peaceful parade along the route which has been laid down.
The civil rights movement up to now has followed a policy of non-violence. Now, are we going to let down the decent people of this country? No! There are a lot of people have suffered. Now, is their suffering going to be in vain? Or can we wait for a few more months to get the reforms which must inevitably come? We'll fight them. One goes on. We'll fight them. Come on!
As the stewards lost control, Catholic demonstrators were for the first time violent.
But I have also said that if there should arise a crisis in this land, when I would be needed to enter the political arena, I would not fear, but I would go with the support of the Protestant people of Ireland. A solemn declaration to you that if there is an election in the near future in Ulster, whether in prison or out of prison, I'm going to fight O'Neill and Vance.
Paisley was now emerging as a major Protestant politician. In February 1969, Protestant demonstrators in Belfast were chanting, "O'Neill must go." Then in March and April, there were bomb attacks against water and electricity installations. It was assumed to be the responsibility of the IRA. Actually, they'd been perpetrated by Protestant extremists. However, these incidents raised old fears and anxieties about the IRA. As water was taken from standpipes, O'Neill was blamed for the degenerating situation and the rebirth of the IRA. On the 28th of April, 1969, he resigned.
What is now impossible for me may be, I do not know, easier for someone else. But I have no regrets for 6 years in which I have tried to break the chains of ancient hatred. I have been unable to realize during my period of office all that I had sought to achieve. Whether now it can be achieved in my lifetime, I do not know.
The Unionist Party meets to elect a new leader who would automatically become Prime Minister.
Gentlemen, as Chief Whip of the Unionist Party...
There were two candidates. James Chichester Clark, thought to be more moderate than his rival, Brian Faulkner.
Major J.D. Chichester Clark, 17 votes. Mr. Brian Faulkner, 16.
Chichester Clark was related to O'Neill. British politicians at Westminster were following events in the province with increasing concern. Traditional Protestant summer marches were likely to spark off trouble. Chichester Clark would be urged by James Callaghan, Home Secretary and responsible for Northern Ireland, to ban all marches.
Banning these marches, which seem to cause so much trouble in Northern Ireland?
One judges each occasion on its merits and tries to act sensibly and with discretion and responsibility as the situation arises.
The Apprentice Boys' March, celebrating the relief of the Siege of Londonderry in 1689, went ahead. To have banned it would have put Chichester Clark's political career in jeopardy. "15,000 Protestants marched that day in a city of only 50,000 people, the majority Catholic. In the Catholic Bogside, barricades were built. Over the past 8 months, the police had twice attacked the area, damaging property as they harassed and taunted the residents. The pomp and strut of the march was met with Catholic jibes. "700 police stood by. During the afternoon, Catholic youth stoned the march as it passed the Bogside. The predictable disorder had begun. To no avail, moderates on both sides tried to defuse the situation. As both sides threw stones, the police stood with their backs to the Protestant rioters.
Move back, please. Move back to the footpath.
Oh, but I belong to Jerry and I know that, friend. I know that. At the same time, these men here have to keep their backs to you and watch them. You're not helping them. So it appeal to you to go way back.
The police feared that if the Catholics broke out of the Bogside, they would attack Protestant areas. The Catholics were afraid of what the police might do if they got into the Bogside.
It is perfectly obvious that this country, under the present constitution, is ungovernable. You have civilians living in this area who are forced to barricade the place and to launch an almost military offensive on the police force of this country. Not because the people in this area want to break the law, but because they know that if they do not keep the police out of this area, that the police will come in here and ruin their homes and attack their wives and children. Therefore, since the police force are the people who are in fact disturbing the peace, there can be no confidence in the machinery of government.
In the early evening, the police tried to break through the barricades into the Bogside. What had begun as an incident between police and a handful of youths had become a pitched battle. By nightfall, it was stalemate. Petrol bombs from Catholic youths were being answered by CS gas from the police. It was the first time CS gas had been used in the United Kingdom. On the evening of the second day, Chichester Clark went on television.
The irresponsible should know this. The law must and will be maintained. We have already said that we will not shrink from any necessary measure, however firm or however unpalatable. To that end, we are now acting to strengthen the hand of the forces of law and order. We will also use the special constabulary to the full, not for riot or crowd control, but to relieve the regular police of other duties.
The mobilization of the 8,500 B specials inflamed the Catholic population.
Somebody tries to throw that, the top will come out and the petrol will go all over his back. That's why we've had people turned down there. So get the cork in very, very tight, as tight as you can.
The local dairies later reported the loss of 43,000 milk bottles. That afternoon, with the RUC exhausted, Chichester Clark asked for troops to be sent in. In London, the Home Office had already decided their use was inevitable. As night fell, sympathetic rioting broke out across the province.
One prominent Catholic leader at that time, a political leader, who called on the people of Belfast, the Catholic population of Belfast, to come out onto the streets to relieve the people of Derry. Now, basically what he was saying was that the Catholic population in Belfast should come out and create as much mayhem as they possibly could to withdraw, so that the security forces would have to withdraw the RUC to deal with the problem then in Belfast. And once this was stated, then the Protestant population reacted in the only way they possibly could to defend their areas. They went out and attacked the Catholics.
You had the police invading the Ardoyne and Falls Road areas of Belfast, these areas being attacked by B Specials and by loyalist paramilitants, a number of people being killed, streets of Catholic houses being burned down. And in that situation, there was a crying demand from the Catholic population for defence, for physical defence.
In Belfast, the police failed to control Protestant mobs, and fierce fighting had broken out along the sectarian divide. 8 people died that night. Whole Catholic streets were gutted. In the morning, Belfast Catholics were filmed abandoning their houses. 1,500 Catholics had lost their homes.
I would say that I don't think actually the IRA went on the offensive. The people went on the offensive. You know, it was the people who had enough at that time. They were brought out into the open. They were brought onto the streets because of the intimidation, the burnings. The people came onto the streets. The IRA were there also, but everybody, literally everybody in a nationalist or Catholic ghetto, call it what you will, came onto the streets because they knew at some stage their house or their home, they would be affected. And if one grew from the other or one gave support to the other, then it was inevitable.
69 was horrific because of the burnings out, because of the turmoil that took place in the ghettos. It committed everyone to either defence or attack, but it committed people to be counted.
The realisation that the nationalist people were under attack, there was nobody to defend them. I was a member of the nationalist community at that time. Okay, I was only 15 and a half, but I knew what I had to do, and I did it. And I joined the struggle from then on.
When 69 occurred, my father, who had never, and I think this is a conscious decision on his part, never talked about the IRA or talked about armed resistance or glorified in past IRA campaigns, started to equate developments and started to talk freely for the first time about comparisons between what we were going through and rioting that had taken place in the 30s and in the 20s.
I'll never forget the first time I seen somebody walking down the street with a rifle, and this was in Comber Street, and taking up position to return fire. And these were just ordinary blokes that lived in the area, and they were taking up arms to defend it.
To avert civil war in the province and the possibility of a pogrom against Catholics in Belfast, the British government had been forced to send in the British Army. With the army now on the streets, the British government would have to concern itself more directly with the politics of Northern Ireland. But interest and intervention had come too late. Events now had a relentless logic of their own. In the ghettos of scarred and gutted streets that the army now patrolled, the IRA had begun to reorganize. The prospect of armed Republicans produced an inevitable reaction amongst militant Protestants.
You felt the whole tension, all over the whole of Ulster, where you lived and all, you know what I mean? There was a very thing atmosphere, cold atmosphere and everything. And then you start to realise, well, something's happened here now, like, because they're not just throwing stones and all now, they're using guns.
I know it's hard for a Protestant to say, but I think it was really the Protestants that brought forward the upsurge of the Provos at that time by the actions they took. I don't disagree with the actions because it was the only thing we could do in those days. There was nothing else we could do. We could either just sit back and let the civil rights trample us down, and I, for one, was never willing to do that.
I felt that what I'd been brought up to believe and was being taken away from me, what my parents had worked hard for to build up a home and a decent family, was all suddenly going to be taken off them. And it took them 30 years to build our home and family up, and somebody was just going to come in and take it off them. Well, I said to myself, this isn't on.
We knew something like this was going to happen. Not to the scale it did happen, but it was going to come out. And we expected it. But it hardened the case in my part to really then fight fire with fire. And the only way then to get rid of civil rights, the IRA, the lot, was to wipe them off the face of the earth. And this was the basic attitude of mine and I had to start.
Protestants from Spring Martin Estate formed up 300 yards away across waste ground behind Union Jacks. The tension increased. Troops were moved up further along the road towards the Catholic crowds. A man who tried to make a lone dash towards the Protestants was hauled back by friends.
The present phase of the Troubles, the longest in Ireland's history, had begun.
After an earlier confrontation down the end, which looked at the time like the kind of civil rights clash we knew from years ago.
A few minutes later, the first exploded.
The army have said throughout the day that they hope to use minimum force, but 3 hours after the procession began, this has ended up, as dust comes onto the bogside, as the worst ever confrontation between the army and Craighan and Bogside.
Twice before, the army has successfully defused bombs, but today the terrorists managed to hit a primary target.
First among the causes, the Commission puts the growing sense of injustice and grievance among Catholics over inadequate housing and unfair allocation of houses by some local authorities. Other points cover complaints of anti-Catholic discrimination in local government appointments, resentment at the continuance of the Special Powers Act, and the existence of the B Specials as a partisan force, not an exclusive one.
Convention, Part 1, Sales Version.